I'm going to be talking about the topic of my recent book, The New Climate War, which is about the challenges that we still face in addressing what is arguably the greatest crisis we face as a civilization, human-caused climate change. And I'm going to go back in time a half century, because that's when scientists already understood enough of the basics to predict that the planet would continue to warm up if we continued to burn fossil fuels. Here's one prediction that was spot on. It predicted both the increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the warming that would result from that back in the late 1970s. It's not Al Gore. It's not from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a prediction that was made by ExxonMobil, the world's largest publicly traded fossil fuel company. And their own scientists in an internal report back in 1982 had referred to the potential impacts of that warming as catastrophic. But what did they do? Did they come forward with what they knew? No, they buried that report. They got rid of that division, and ExxonMobil proceeded to spend tens of millions of dollars engaged in what is arguably the greatest misinformation campaign in the history of modern civilization. If you've been following the headlines, you may have seen the story just yesterday about an Exxon lobbyist who was caught on tape, basically admitting that they were funding dark money groups to discredit the science of climate change. And they've been doing so for decades. And as a result, we have a much steeper descent, a much greater challenge if we are to avert catastrophic warming of the planet of more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, and we're already a little over 1 degree. We now have to bring our carbon emissions down by a factor of 2 within the next decade. So that's the lost opportunity, the opportunity cost of decades of inaction, thanks in large part to fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil and their disinformation efforts. And the impacts of climate change, as we all know, they're no longer subtle. We're seeing them play out in real time. In Europe and the United States, record heat waves that have tripled in frequency and intensity in just the last few decades. Unprecedented wildfires, places like California, the heat, the drought combining to give us these apocalyptic wildfires. And here is an article that just appeared a little more than a month ago in the Washington Post, exactly as it appeared on my screen. California facing drought crisis as water shortages mount and fire danger escalates. Brought to you by ExxonMobil. That's exactly the way it appeared on my screen. There's great irony there. And of course, if you've been following the news, we have been experiencing a record heat dome. Canada just set the hottest record for the hottest temperature, just under 50 degrees Celsius during this unprecedented heat wave. And yeah, it's climate change. We wouldn't be able to explain this if it were not for the warming of the planet due to fossil fuel burning. Not just the United States in the Northern Hemisphere, but down in Australia, where I spent a sabbatical 1.5 years ago during what they now refer to as the Black Summer, when wildfires, bushfires blanketed the continent. A year and a few months later, that same region of New South Wales, where I was doing my sabbatical, experienced this. And your eyes aren't deceiving you. That's a house floating down a river, unprecedented flooding. So we go from unprecedented heat and drought to unprecedented flooding. That doesn't contradict the science of climate change. In fact, climate models predict greater extremes on both sides of the spectrum, like we're seeing, and often with catastrophic impacts, like California and the mudslides that they've seen in recent years. So this is the face of climate change. It's not distant. It's not off in the future. It's here and now. And that's just 1 degree Celsius. Imagine what 4 or more degrees Celsius would do. And that's where we'll be headed if we don't take meaningful action. And again, part of the reason we haven't taken those actions has been a concerted effort by fossil fuel interests to prevent us from moving on. I testified a few years ago to the US House of Representatives, to a committee that was chaired by a climate change denier who's funded by the fossil fuel industry, Lamar Smith. That was a few years ago. Things have changed quite a bit. You see much less of this sort of outright denial of the basic evidence, because it isn't credible, because people can see that climate change is happening. And so what this new book really is about are the new tactics that are being used by the fossil fuel industry that stop just short of denying the basic science, but engage in soft denial. Oh, it's real, but it's not really a problem, and we can just adapt. Don't worry about it. Delay. Again, we don't have to do anything other than adapt or, be more resilient. We can continue to burn fossil fuels. It's just a matter of us changing, our behavior, becoming more resilient, or engaging in geoengineering, massive global scale interference with our planetary environment in the hope that that might somehow offset the warming impact of greenhouse gases, shooting particles into the stratosphere, dumping iron into the ocean. Unsurprisingly, it's supported by some of the forces of inaction, those who don't want to see us wean ourselves off fossil fuels, like the former Secretary of State under Donald Trump, Rex Tillerson, who was also the former CEO of ExxonMobil, and dismisses climate change as just an engineering problem. We can engineer our way out of it. Bill Gates, another billionaire tech figure who believes in technology, believes that we can solve this problem by technology, and downplays the role, for example, of existing solutions, renewable energy. Kicking the can down the road, the idea that, hey, we can impose a techno fix down the road a decade from now, 2 decades from now, often used as an excuse for not taking the necessary action of reducing carbon emissions today. It's not the right path forward. The right path forward is using the technology we already have today, renewable energy technology, to decarbonize our civilization. We can do it. We don't need a miracle, Bill Gates, as he's claimed before. We just need the political will. Deflection is another tactic, and you'll notice they all start with D. You've got denial, delay, deflection. It was used by the beverage industry decades ago to convince us that we didn't need regulations, bottle bills, for example, that would require them to process, return bottle and cans. Instead, we just need people to be better stewards of the environment. We just need to pick up our bottles and cans and trash. This idea of redirecting attention towards individual behavior rather than systemic change has been used by the fossil fuel industry, and even mainstream news outlets like the New York Times have often bought into this framing, this idea that it's just about us changing our food habits, our transportation, our lifestyle. And it's a very useful way, once again, of redirecting effort away from the need for policies, carbon pricing, subsidies for renewables, blocking new fossil fuel infrastructure, all things that we can't do ourselves. We need our politicians to do, but that'll hurt the bottom line of the fossil fuel industry. They don't want that to happen. So they want to make it just about our individual lifestyle. It isn't a coincidence that British Petroleum gave us the very first carbon footprint calculator in the early 2000s, because British Petroleum and other fossil fuel companies wanted us so focused on our own carbon footprint that we failed to notice theirs. And I realize running short on time. So then there's division, getting us fighting with each other so that we don't represent a united front demanding policy action. Often taking, there's Friendly Fire, progressive filmmaker Michael Moore, who inexplicably made a movie attacking renewable energy. And why he did that, we don't know. What we do know is that it was a gift to the fossil fuel industry. And who was promoting that film? It wasn't progressives. It was conservative media outlets and fossil fuel front groups and the Murdoch media empire, attacking key opinion leaders like our special envoy on climate, John Kerry, trying to discredit them as hypocrites because they still use air travel. Again, plays into this deflection and division, and we know who's doing it. And then finally, doomism. If we really become convinced that it's too late to do anything about the problem, it potentially leads us down the same path of inaction as outright denial. And so the forces of inaction, the inactivists, as I call them in the book, are often fanning the flames of doomism, trying to convince, environmental progressives that, hey, it's too late to do anything anyway, so why bother? Winning the war. What is it about? It's about urgency and agency. Yes, there is great urgency. As deadly as the COVID-19 crisis has been, climate change is far deadlier. It will cost far more lives if we fail to act meaningfully. So there's urgency, but there's agency. We have the solutions now. We don't need a miracle. We just need policies that will incentivize renewable energy and a dramatic shift away from our reliance on fossil fuels. Renewable energy is already cheaper on a levelized basis than fossil fuel energy. It's just the fact that we don't have policies to accelerate the transition that's already underway towards renewable energy. And we are seeing that transition. We are seeing global carbon emissions start to bend, that curve start to bend downward. They flattened out in recent years. They came down last year by 7%. And if we can keep that up every year for the next decade, we're on that path to reducing carbon emissions by a factor of 2 within the decade and averting 1.5 degrees Celsius dangerous warming. But much of those reductions last year were due to the pandemic, social distancing measures, decreased transportation that were temporary. And so we've seen those carbon emissions start to come back as the economy has come back. And it's a reminder that individual behavioral change, lifestyle change alone won't do it. We need policies that will decarbonize our economy, our global economy. And we're seeing some good developments. We're seeing new leadership from the United States that is leading other actors and transition actors to get a little bit more serious about their own commitments to dealing with the climate crisis. We've seen some big losses for the fossil fuel industry in recent months. So a lot of things that are coming together. And then you have a global youth climate movement that has really focused this issue on the ethical dimensions of the climate crisis, because it's not just about science and economics and policy and politics. It's about what sort of planet we want to leave behind for our children and grandchildren. And there's still time to make sure that our future, that our legacy is not a degraded planet, that we do maintain a vibrant, thriving and healthy planetary environment for our children and grandchildren and future generations. Let's make sure that that is our legacy. Thank you.